right now. We're recording, and I am dropping the CLAS YouTube channel link in the chat. That's where the recording will be located, so you can find it there and share it. It'll be up in a couple of days. This presentation is the work of the Colorado LGBTQ History Project for the Center on Colfax. The History Project documents LGBTQ history in Colorado through oral histories, getting documents into libraries, teaching about Colorado LGBTQ history, and networking with other institutions to talk about that history. Specifically, this panel grew out of the Matt Kailey History Committee, which was formed in 2017 in response to the transgender military ban. The committee has offered talks, deposited archives into libraries, and documented transgender history in Colorado. Matt Kailey, for those of you who don't know, was a pioneering trans male award-winning journalist, activist, author, and educator based in Colorado when he died suddenly at the age of 58. Our speakers tonight are Jen W., who is a Matt Kailey History Committee member and has a background in nutrition and music. She comes from the East Coast and has worked on many projects, including the Colorado Transgender History Quilt and Trans Music for Queer Youth. She runs a radio show in her spare time. Emily Ferrafino-Coquino is a non-binary local historian and a founding member of the Matt Kailey History Committee. Emily has an MA in history from the University of Colorado, Denver, and is currently working on several personal projects having to do with Colorado and Denver history. David Duffield is a local teacher and founder and coordinator of the Colorado LGBTQ History Project. He is a graduate student in history at CU Denver and has a BA in history and secondary social studies education from MSU Denver. He's currently organizing intersectional and regional LGBTQ history committees around Colorado, and good work they are all doing. I just want to end by reminding everybody about Zoom etiquette. I've muted everybody for the presentation, and when we get to Q&A, I'm asking that we all use the hand raise feature under your reactions at the bottom of the screen, or ask chat questions in the chat, and I'll unmute you if you want to speak at that point. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to mute myself and turn my video off. Let's get going.
All right, folks, my name is David Duffield. I'll be helping to lead this talk tonight. I'm proud that we have this opportunity to speak with you, and I'll be sharing my screen in just a moment. For any of you who are interested in getting a link to this presentation, I'll be sharing that in the chat in just a few minutes. Just a quick note, everyone can hear me and everyone can see what I'm presenting. Is that correct? No problems? All right. Tonight's talk is from our work based on global LGBTQ history. I'm esteemed and proud to share this panel with my colleagues, Emily and Jen, who will be helping with different parts of this speech and different parts of this talk tonight. The title of tonight's talk is Queering the Americas, Gender and Sexuality Before Conquest. I would personally just like to offer my esteemed thanks to folks in just a moment, but a quick overview. We're going to be talking about the history of gender and sexuality amongst the Mayan, Nahua, and Quechuan peoples. We will cover a periodization from roughly the pre-classical and archaic periods of each empire and the gender and sexuality roles in the historical presentation of queerness of those roles in each culture. So in essence, we're going to cover the history of each empire, the roles of men, women, and gender in those empires, and then we're going to cover the periodization and history of those empires in the context setting of gender and sexuality of those empires as well. So we're going to touch on queerness, but we're going to look at queerness from a more holistic, large-scale view. A note on our language tonight, queerness represents a non-heteronormative gender practice, same-sex desire, and third gender. We believe it is important to discuss our use of language. Today, we'll be looking at queer representation in 3 of these indigenous Latin American communities that exist today. The use of terms like gay, lesbian, or transgender are more modern terms, which the peoples of pre-colonial Latin America never had access to and indeed would never have called themselves. While modern communities in Latin America may have used those terms, we are choosing to use the culturally appropriate terms for queer communities of the pre-colonial period. We believe that the context of the period will set the proper use of the identity. We want to give special thanks to the CU Denver's History and Ethnic Studies Department, as well as our committee members, Emily and Jen. Without you, this talk would not be possible. We want to give special thanks to the Center on Colfax, as well as to our community members who gave us outreach and feedback on this presentation tonight. While we acknowledge that the language may not necessarily be appropriate for everyone, we ask for folks' indulgence when identifying the idea of queerness. Queerness can be an expansive concept. It can be a concept that doesn't just talk about non-heteronormative, non-gender binary bodies, but more than that. We intend to explore how the use of queerness is used by communities in Latin America this evening over the next 30 minutes. A quick note on our cited works. We relied heavily on the work of Zeb Tortorici, Pete Segal, and Michael Horswell for this talk. Specifically, Tortorici talks about the history of colonial Latin America post-conquest, as well as gender and sexuality. Pete Segal looks at, does a very, very good job of looking at Mayan gender and sexuality before the conquest. And then Michael Horswell's book, Decolonizing the Sodomite from 2005 is an excellent look at queerness and third gender identities in Andean cultures. I would also strongly recommend the work of David Bowles, a translator and Nahua linguist, as well as the work of Gontijo et al., and a few of the other articles listed here, particularly Pekin Tukina, and the history of gender and expression from the University of California. There's also the Global History of Encyclopedia, which we will add to the slide deck when we're finished. So first, a quick note about the Maya. The Maya live and continue to live in present-day Central America. They occupy the area basically in what one can consider southeastern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. They live in hundreds and hundreds of villages. There are millions of current speakers for of the Mayan language today, and they occupy many, many different regions. Throughout Latin American history, Mayan people have been subject to different types of conquest, rebellion, and have always been their own people. There were several rebellions in the late 19th century and wars against the Maya in Guatemala as late as the 1980s. There have been genocides against the Maya, as well as cultural genocides. One of the more interesting facts, which we'll talk about tonight, is that despite cultural genocide, restoration of the Mayan languages from codices and from written accounts in Mayan ruins has enabled the restoration of part of over 600 of over 20,000 indigenous Mayan words and Mayan writing. If we imagine cultural genocide, one of the things we have to imagine is that someone comes along, destroys all our books, and all we're left with is oral tradition and the inscriptions written upon our ruins. Without access to knowledge, we become divorced from our spiritual and temporal selves. And yet, despite that cultural genocide, which includes the genocide of queer identities as part and parcel of the reason behind it, the cultures that exist today have survived that. And in honor of Indigenous Peoples Day, we have to recognize that those cultures have survived not simply some of the worst horrors in human history, but continue to exist, not just in Central and South America, but in North America as well. And while our talk will focus primarily on those three peoples of the Nahua, Mayan, and Andean peoples, we want to also acknowledge that there are two-spirit and histories of gender nonconforming people throughout all of the Americas, if not world and global heritage. So who are the Maya? The Maya have been around for thousands and thousands of years in Central and South, in the Yucatan Peninsula. The periodization of the history is typically divided between the pre-classical period or the archaic period before about 2000 BCE, the pre-classical period from about 2000 BCE to 200 CE, the classical period from 250 CE to 950 CE, and then the post-classical period from 950 to about 1539 CE. The pre-classical period of the Maya was dominated by the creation of city-states as well as the first kinds of hard metal cultures. During the classic period of the Maya, as well as the classic periods of the Nahua and the Indian peoples, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, you see the creation of the first massive empires. Cities like Tikal and others begin about this period. The flourishing of art and pyramids like El Castillo on the right, which have been refurbished, which was once brightly colored red and green, enable us to imagine what the architecture of these cities was like before the fall of the post-classic period, and the decline of the Maya around the 12th century due to drought. The post-classic period kind of ends with a periodization of war and fighting amongst the different Mayan peoples, with the consolidation of power in the Maya-Pan alliance in the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula around the 14th or 13th century. What ends up happening is that there are several ecological droughts that affect the whole of Central South America, if not the world. Massive periods of drought eventually lead to periods of deforestation. Lack of deforestation creates a lack of food, and a lack of food eventually creates warring city-states and a depopulation of many of the cities, in which people flee from city to city, concentrating along the coasts and in the highlands. After the post-classic period, from 950 to 1539, you see the consolidation of power around major city-states, but particularly along the coasts. You also see the jungle growing in and around major cities from the classical period, and the recovery of these in the 19th century. Gender and sexuality amongst the Maya was as complex as it was difficult to interpret just from the stelae and from the records alone. One of the more interesting figures that we get from the archaeological record is that of the moon goddess, who was the traditional female deity and was associated with female deities in most of the great cultures. She's considered with water, she's associated with water, and as well as the cenotes, which are the sacred portal, which are the sacred routes to the underworld in the Yucatan Peninsula. According to the Popol Vuh, which is the creation myth of the Quiche Maya, she is associated with menstruation, rebirth, and presented as the wife of the sun god. This shifts in the post-classic period to the so-called goddess one, of the white goddess, who is associated with a woman holding a rabbit, who may represent the trickster god. The moon goddess is associated with women's roles in Mayan society, particularly women who are head of households and women giving birth. Women, as in many cultures, found roles as progenitors of culture, raising children, and participated in economic, governmental, and farming activities. Marriage for Maya women occurred between adolescence and young adulthood outside of her household, and women were taught to keep shrines in their homes. In other words, the role of women was highly ritualistic. In rituals in particular, a principle of what we call complementarity, or a balance between men and women playing equal but opposite roles, was the ideological basis, including different pairings. This idea of complementarity addresses much of what we understand about gender in the Nahua and Mayan and Andean cultures. In clothing, stela depicting history and representations of deities, there is a dichotomy between male and female. And this balance between male and female becomes central to our understanding of what maybe queer epistemologies, what third gender or gender non-conforming identities may have looked like in the context of Maya history. Balance, in short, becomes equal parts from male and female. Men, as in many cultures, were often regarded roles in hunting and providing for the home. Archaeologist Rosemary Joyce, in her book, A Pre-Columbian Gaze, Male Sexuality Among the Ancient Maya, called it a hegemonic masculinity, and that men had complete dominance over women. She notes that there was a compulsory military service for men. Men were taught farming and hunting at a young age. However, men had dominance over women not simply in the household, but outside the household. And yet the balance of men outside the household was not the same as it was in ritual. Men did not hold the same positions as women in ritual. They were equal and opposite. Gender then was constructed as a balance or in equal parts, dominance and balance. Sexuality was referred in direct ways, it was referred to in indirect ways, often as in many ancient cultures through innuendo, metaphor, and even games. Historian Pete Segal translated the ritual of the Bakebes, and he quotes, "I am dipping, penetrating with genitals of your mother and genitals of your father. You are the desire of the children and the women and the desire of the children of the men. Amen." And while this is a very direct description, it's set in the context of a massive myth. Sex may have been more for procreative reasons, but was not as highly regarded, according to Segal, in the imagery as was the bloodletting rituals or ceremonies that the Spanish so concentrated on centuries later. There are various phallic stones as well around the Yucatan Peninsula. And as we'll discuss in a few moments, the symbology or significance of these spaces is not necessarily lost on the archaeologists who interpreted them for us today. The idea is that the phallus or the emblem or the space marked by a certain kind of myth or poem sets the significance of the space. Indeed, it reveals a liminal space and the cultural scripts of these spaces that were evident to the Maya then, but despite centuries of decline and lack of context in written records, these kinds of spaces don't necessarily make sense to someone walking into them, but they certainly did to the Maya who attended them as well. When we talk about gender and queer identities in the period of the post-classic period, there's several examples that come to mind. The first on the right is one of the few known cave depictions from Naj Tunish, which was discovered in 1979. According to archaeologists who excavated the site, it was a site of ritual pilgrimage around the year 900 AD. So this is just before the decline of the classical period. You can clearly see two men engaged in frottage or rubbing their genitals together. Amongst the other paintings in this cave were myths talking about sexuality and fertility rites. And surrounding this several miles away were phalluses and different kinds of signifiers of sexual spaces. It deeply associates, according to the archaeologists, the connection between sexuality and spirituality in the Mayan world. The idea that in order to have balance, you had to have a balance between male and female. One of the other few examples we have from the Maya talking about the history of gender and third gender identities is a stela from Copan around 700 CE. Known as the Copan stela on the left, it talks about the ruler 18 Rabbit. 18 Rabbit was a famous warrior. He was like the Ramses II of Copan, a major figure in their histories and referenced widely in the different stelae and stories of the city. During this particular ritual, he was noted to have cross-dressed and gone into the netherworld. And though he was a warrior, he probably didn't cross-dress in everyday life. The significance of the major king and military leader dressing in male and female clothing is representative of the idea of balance between genders as well. Rulers accessed Mayan power by accessing both the feminine and the masculine. The Mayan, like the Aztecs, sometimes made captives dress up like women to make fun of them. Sometimes they castrated them and used them for sex work. However, according to Segal, transsexuality was a way of signifying completeness and wholeness in Mayan society. The masculine role of the ruler was symbolized by accessing masculine and feminine power, which contrasts with European power constructions from, say, the 2nd century BCE to the 14th century CE. The idea of this European hegemonic masculinity in contrast to a Mayan hegemonic masculinity seems a little bit different. But whatever the construction of the meaning, it is clear that what rulers and people of the Mayan states saw as balance between the sexes was also balance between the different forces of the world, between the mother and the father, between the sun and the moon, between this dialectic. And what others thought 18 Rabbit did was not necessarily wear clothing, but access a higher spiritual plane. He did so in the context of trying to bring balance and trust to the people with whom he ruled. Cross-dressing was likely the source of the ritual behavior, and the Maya placed the warrior in the social constructions of the societal order. What that means is that the textual use of transsexuality in the contemporary sense was to maintain male power and dominance, according to Segal. There was a strong association, however, between the ritual and homosexual behavior. Some shamans engaged in homosex with their patients, and some priests engaged in homosexual acts with their gods. We see renditions of homosexual acts, particularly between men in the Mayan and the Andean cultures, Quechuan cultures, going as far back as 500 CE. Oftentimes, this was associated with drug use, but was deeply connected to spirituality and ritual. The contemporary Western view is that sexuality is materialistic and divorced from spirituality, but that doesn't seem to be the case in the classical pre-Andean, pre-conquest cultures. Few of us may know what was going through the minds of Mayans and indigenous peoples going into this period of time, but what is evidence is that the connection between male and female cross-dressing was connected to ritual and balance. And then, of course, we come to the Spanish. Post-conquest, there were simply centuries of atrocities. The Spanish conquered the Nahua peoples with the help of allies in 1519, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. In the post-colonial world, the Mexica was renamed the Viceroyalty of New Spain, and that was preceded, and what preceded it perhaps was the longest and cruelest cultural and demographic genocide in human history. Very little of Nahua writing remains, yet the Spanish explorers who often oppressed, killed, and enslaved native peoples made remarks about their journey and included references to LGBTQ people, or people we would identify as third gender and people who love those of the same sex. Diego Alvarez Chanca, a doctor accompanying Columbus, wrote a letter about the Carib people who castrated male captives and developed quote unquote feminine characteristics, and who were kept for practice of sodomy, comparing them to similar Arab traditions that they had driven out from Spain not 100 years before within that generation of 1492. Peter de Anguilla noted in De Orbe Nove Dacares that Balboa, when he visited Panama, noted that a brother of the king, quote, was and other young men, obliging men, dressed effeminately with women's clothing, and became so upset that he threw, quote, 40 of them into a pit and sicked his dogs upon them. What you see on the right is a rendition from his book in 1594, nearly 80 years after the actual event, of people being killed. Now, whether or not these were people we would identify as third gender, what this does reveal is the Spanish attitude about queerness or same-sex love or gender nonconformity. As the historian as Michael Horswell notes in his book, the Spanish believed that any sort of gender nonconformity upset their own masculinity, their own hegemonic masculinity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But to illustrate the point a little bit further, there was another story of European cruelty that was documented by a Capuchin priest named Yves Devereux, who reported that an intersex indigenous person who had been chased down by the French in northern Brazil, where they were tied to the mouth of a cannon, and the chief was made to light the fuse in front of the rest of the indigenous community. The purpose of this was supposedly to, quote, purify the land. This would signify some of the kinds of centuries of barbarous and cultural genocide and brutality at the hands of the Spanish, particularly in the New World, not to mention the rest of the Europeans. Now, Michael Horswell notes, as does Zeb Tortorici, that other scholars have reached the same conclusion that the Spanish reconquest was an extension, the Spanish conquest of the New World was an extension of the Reconquista against Jews and Moors in the 1400s. According to Zeb Tortorici, the reconquest, or the people who were conquered, were viewed as effeminates by the by the Spanish, and that extension of masculinity for the conqueror and effeminacy for the conquered extended to the New World peoples as well. Horswell notes that the Spanish Inquisition was an extension of Spanish masculinity and tropes of conquered versus conquering as more effeminized peoples, and especially in 16th century literature. The Spanish destroyed so much of the physical infrastructure that contained large amounts of homoerotic and queer imagery, of same-sex love, and of third gender embodiment, that this became one of the foundational reasons for the Spanish Inquisition of the cultures and cultural genocide against the cultures of the New World. In other words, queerness, or upsetting Spanish masculinity, was a definite reason behind the conquest. The Inquisition heavily influenced the next 400 years of gender and sexuality for the people of the Americas by imposing Catholic values upon the populace. In other words, moralizing them, focusing on the bodies of women, hiding them from public view, and shaming women in particular for their virginity. What we know of gender and sexuality comes from the Spanish, but specifically that first generation of historians and scholars after the conquest. We have the works of people like Bartolomeo de las Casas, Historia de las Indias in 1556, Inca Galescao de la Vega, or Pedro de Cieza de León, La Crónica del Perú in 1533. They translate local legends and create the first written syllabaries and dictionaries between Spanish and the indigenous languages. In those dictionaries, we find accounts of local indigenous cultures creating concepts around third gender spaces, particularly cross-dressing and same-sex behavior, often accompanied by male and females, or females and males who work and dress and use sexual activity of what the Spanish view as the opposite gender, representing the Spanish worldview as a gender binary. In short, a categorical analysis of what Judith Butler would call in later centuries gender performativity. We must stop to think about how Spanish concepts of sin and morality influence our own interpretations of this today. If they permanently altered the cultural concepts of temporal gender and sexual understanding, how can contemporary understandings of queerness be communicated through generations? How much are contemporary concepts of queerness different from what may be far older and traditional forms of, in addition to how will those discourses compare with each other and grow from one another? In other words, has the Spanish interpretation of the indigenous queerness poisoned the well? Yet where the heart may see the same embodiment and claims a hand in history lies the anachronistic trap of applying contemporary understanding to past lived experiences. And here's what that means. We cannot name past complex. And while we see that in general, Mesoamerican cultures from the Archaic period to the Classic period may have aligned along Central and South American cultures, with the Nahua and the Aztec peoples, it seems to be a little bit more militaristic. Women in Mesoamerican cultures were generally assigned the ritual textile making, and in Nahua imagery, oftentimes were signified as preparing food. Men were associated again with agriculture, hunting, and militaristic pursuits. Boys, like in the Mayan culture, were trained in military pursuits and in some cases through games, and were conscripted into compulsory military service at about the age of 13 or 14, while women were associated with textile and food production, which were at the core of family rituals. Women's work was also blurred sometimes with that of men. There was an exceptional amount of gender and sexual fluidity in depictions of deities in central Mexico. Anthropologist Miranda Stockett noted that it was inappropriate for contemporary understandings of gender and sexuality to be applied to Mesoamerican cultures, that in fact we should focus on exploring pre-Columbian identity in the context of the time in order to understand the merit of gender and sexuality before conquest. As with Mayan society and gender complementarity, or balances between gender and ritual and life, where there is greater association with higher virtues in the balance between male and female. In short, as within Mayan society, there's a balance between men and women, between male and female energies that reaches into a transcendent higher plane. Also, as with the Maya, the chroniclers who came after, like Bernardino de Sahagún, Alonso de Zorita, Diego Duran, and Toribio Motolomonia, were deeply influenced by Christianity and the performativity of bodies in the empire, which is why they may have assigned categories of gender in their interpretation of Nahua culture and translation, paying little attention to women's roles. And not until the 1970s, with feminist theory and archaeology, at least this according to Stockett, were these assumptions about gender questioned. That is, that gender was virtually ignored until the feminist period, the advent of feminist theory in the 1970s applied to archaeology. But essentially, that power was primary, that male power was primary. Prior to the rise of the Aztec Empire, gender roles were more egalitarian, although anthropologist June Nash in Gender Deities and the Survival of Culture notes that prior to the social stratification created by the state, as in the Aztecs, Most politics was clan-based in Nahua society. There were kinship systems which provided justice in different roles and provided more social roles for women. A kind of restorative justice was a framework. As evidence, she takes the decline of female representation in deities after the 8th century, who were also dual gender or androgynous in Nahua pantheons, in contrast with deities like Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and the war. So in other words, in the pantheon, you see the decline of female deities and androgynous deities and the rise of hegemonic masculinity or hegemonically masculine deities. The process of cultural significance in which societies create these deities and allegorical myths and cultural representation show the values and the imperatives and the structure of society. The culture reinforces and co-propagates the social structure and order, especially that of the state. Women in Nahua societies could be priestesses, but their work was often associated and relegated to the home, again with ritual. The gender and sexuality roles after conquest focused on by the Spanish Inquisition amplified gender imbalances. As Susan Kellogg notes, in Weaving the Past, a history of Latin America's indigenous women from the pre-Hispanic period to the present, the Spanish focused on marriage groups versus extended family groups as the primary unit of marriage, thus shaming women who did not protect their virginity, covering their bodies and staying indoors as much as possible. In short, women after the conquest were relegated to homes. And when we come to concepts of queer and third gender identities, we're left with some interesting words that come to us from the Spanish chroniclers of the 1500s, as well as the indigenous peoples who worked with them. According to the historians like Zeb Tortorici and Michael Horswell, particularly, we note that there are certain kinds of methods of exploring gender performativity in these indigenous cultures. According to Horswell, the Spanish Inquisition kind of erased or caused a decline in the discourse of third gender or gender performativity in the histories of the period because it was viewed as shameful. So that may have created one form of queer erasure from the 1500s on. The Spanish destroyed so much of the physical infrastructure that contained large amounts of homoerotic imagery that it may be impossible to reclaim more and more glyphs like the one we saw from the Mayan cave in 1979. The Inquisition was also so heavily influenced Latin American societies that over the next 400 years, gender and sexuality for the people of the Americas may have been irrevocably changed from what it was viewed as beforehand. And yet, what we know of gender and sexuality comes from that same source. We know that there are words defined in contemporary cultures talking about queerness and third gender, which we'll talk about in a moment. But one of these existing cultures that we have to give credit to is called the Muxche. The Muxche are a caste of, excuse me, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, are a caste of LGBTQ people who live in the Zapotec cultures of Central and South America, of the Oaxaca region of Central America. The term Muxche was referred to in Zapotec communities, specifically the Isthmus of Yucatan, who are a matriarchal culture in the region of Oaxaca. The contemporary culture may represent a look at the traditional role of gender, especially in the post-conquest world. The Zapotec culture predates most other Nahua cultures, and while the traditional gender roles in the larger cities and the regions were subjugated by the Spanish conquest, the Muxche have remained. They hold a social sexual fluid identity among the Zapotec. They were seen as incarnate trickster figures that served a ritual function. Currently, there are three types: the pintada, meaning those who wear makeup and jewelry; the vestida, meaning they wear women's clothing; and finally, the international, meaning they wear contemporary and urban clothing. This is seen as a characteristic of someone born with, though it is less about sexual identity and more about cultural practices. The Muxche were also traditionally seen as a gift from the gods and retain a vital role within society today. The Muxche identity, according to some historians, is only about 60 to 70 years old, but is a contemporary reclaimed queer identity, conforming with those of the Zapotec past, especially in the context of gender performativity and trans identities of the 1970s and 1980s in Mexico. And yet, from other post-conquest histories, we learn several names and contexts that lend understanding to Nahua views of queerness and third gender identities. Xochihua and Patlache come to us from the work of David Bowles. Bowles translates several sources, including the work of Pete Segal and others. He notes that Xochipilli and Xochiquetzal were better understood as counterparts of the same deity. In short, they were better considered part of a gender fluid deity. They are examples of in the pantheon of indigenous representation of gender fluidity, as well as taken by contemporary people as deities for queer people. The Nahua pantheon is connected then, as many cultures, to representations of balance between genders. Bowles notes that while some Nahua, like the Mexica and the Texcocha, had impositions for sodomy, that it was not necessarily true with people like the Zapotec, and was likely connected to gender and sexual performativity within the empire. In other words, the Muxe and representations like the Xochiquan, Patlache may be connected. Both the Maya and the Aztec dressed male captives in female clothing as a form of punishment, and some of them attempted to belittle them, as in many cases, some also castrated and used them or sold them into sexual servitude. This is, of course, reported by the Spanish, who first note the practice in the 15th century, slightly at or before conquest. Bowles also notes from the Florentine and Tudela codices, one of the few pieces of writing to survive the Spanish conquest, the term Patlache and Xochihua emerge. The term Patlache referred to a person born in a male or female body who performed their gender, doing the work leading a household, or doing men's work, which was not customary. Patlache and the Florentine Codice and other sources referring to women who did the work of men, or specifically had the gourd of men. And it gets a little bit more graphic from there. But the idea is that in the Codice and contemporary Nahua societies, you may be seeing a more transmasculine person, or a person gendered more transmasculine who was embodied female. The flower in Nahua societies is also meant to be associated with femininity and sexuality at birth. Thus, in the word Xochihua, the hua part means the possessor of Xochitl, or flowers. This may be more so for the act of being the receptive partner in certain sexual acts, or for the performativity associated with the embodiment of a woman. Bowles notes the term, excuse my pronunciation, Quechua Yolto, to refer to a man who has the heart of the woman, or who can take on the caregiving roles of a woman. It's the mixing of this gender performativity which lends a queerness to these interpretations, the switching of jobs, the descriptions of sex acts in opposition to gender norms, which lead to the construction of same-sex and gender fluid identities. And then, of course, we come to one of the few pieces of perhaps queer identity that Bowles notes that comes to us from the Florentine Codice. The flower poem, as he calls it, is perhaps one of the only known pieces of queer identified or third body identified poetry to survive the cultural genocide. And here a Patlache woman reads to her girlfriend, or perhaps a person that she is, or they are, or he is romancing. With my rainbow heart, with my rainbow skirt, oh mother dear, I hold myself tall and proud. No nieces, girlfriends in my way. I'm a precious flower and I am everlasting. I've come to live a different life away from all the servant girls. I'm a Huastec woman. My popcorn buds are beautiful. And here on the right, you see a depiction of a Patlache person wearing a cape, but it's the idea of the female embodied person wearing a masculine cape, performing a palangyric, or trying to woo the heart of the person on the left, who is, according to Bowles, a woman. But the idea of a transmasculine body, or a woman-identified body, or a body that is not necessarily gender conforming, wooing that of a woman. Bowles notes that the flower in this poem represents sexuality and is quoted from another Patlache woman to her potential quote-unquote girlfriend. While the description, according to some authors, of the Patlache woman might be more akin to a transmasculine or intersex person, it could even mean something greater. Imagine a scholarship dedicated to the rereading of pre-conquest traditional Nahuan cultures. Imagine that scholarship using the concepts described herein to reread the sources and bring them out into the open for others to look at. What would that look like, I wonder? Then imagine that this is one of the few queer pieces of art to survive the conquest, and you know it because you yourself see your hand in it. Queer hearts are bridged across queer temporalities, and queer subjectivities know each other. What we see in the heart is expressed as equally in the mind. When we come to the Quechuan peoples, we have to understand that Quechua, along with many other kinds of Andean cultures, is ancient, at least as ancient as the peoples who first inhabited the area 15,000 years ago, although a distinctive Quechuan language probably didn't result until several thousand years ago. Archaeological material and agricultural evidence show the first crops like potatoes were created between about 12,500 BCE and 14,000 BCE, creating a long period of trade, between the coast and the higher altiplanos of the Andean cultures, which created extensive growth villages and trade networks. This is mapped out in the book 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus by author Charles Mann. This kind of vertical horticulture created an extensive trade of the first genomically made crops like quinoa, amaranth, and maize, and created large-scale farming systems, of which we have evidence from the Nazca lines several thousand years ago. Their large-scale agriculture led to the invention of ceramic pottery and in other agricultural revolutions across the world, specifically one of the three great agricultural revolutions, which occurred apart in Mesopotamia and China, and quite possibly an aquacultural revolution in Australia, led to large settled populations. So in short, what this means is towns became cities, cities became trade centers became states, states warred with each other, and eventually came and fell and went over time. And an extensive trading system was evidence of culture and civilization. One of the first such large-scale cities were the pyramids at Caral, earthwork and stone pyramids, which I believe are on the order of the same of the pyramids at Giza, which were created around the same time several thousand years ago. And then, of course, larger, later scale earthworks like the Nazca lines I've already mentioned around 500 CE or in the classical era. The flourishing of trade created vast areas of farming and growth in the high altiplanos, and you saw the creation of massive city-states like the Mochi, the Wari, and the city-state of Tiwanaku, which eventually led to the creation and consolidation of an empire of the Inca between 1443 and about 1500, I believe 1532, when they were finally conquered by the Spanish. The Inca and other Quechuan peoples worshiped Viracocha, who was the creator's sun god, and the Sapa Inca, the emperor of the Incan Empire, was believed to be his protectorate on earth. Mama Kia was his wife and the moon goddess. Temples were widespread in the region, and priests were described as healers and chosen women as attendants to the temple. Divination, sacrifice, and oracles were all key to accessing the wayward gods. In short, one accessed the higher plane, not necessarily through the balance of male and female, but through sacrifice and through divination and through oracles, and particularly the different societies around those temples in Indian cultures. This is a map of the Incan Empire between the classic periodization of CE 12, around 1230 AD, here in the center valleys out, and which became eventually one of the largest empires in the world. Women and men were considered equals in Quechuan societies. The Warmi represented a spiritual unity of a man, woman in the physical, animal, and human worlds. Marriage was considered a unit of the community, or an alu. Women and men oftentimes had different roles, but women were notably administrators and administrators of resources because it was viewed as a role within the home. As elsewhere in the region, women had important roles in ritual, textile, and home life. Women in the Incan and other South American cultures had equal roles to men. They could become administrators, priestesses, and even courtly advisors. The Coyapasca, or virgin priestesses, or chosen women, were believed to be the noble women who were chosen consorts of the sun god. This is an inscription of them on the right here from around 1533. The Spanish imposed a strict patriarchy upon the women of the Andes, which saw remarkable decline in the status of women of the region after the conquest. The homosocial institution of the Coyapasca was a direct threat to Spanish patriarchy, according to Horswell, as well as religious patriarchy. And yet the decline of such spaces, these homosocial spaces of the Coyapasca, as we'll see in a moment, was deeply connected to the harsh patriarchy and persecution of queer people among Andean peoples. In short, women's roles declined significantly after the conquest by the Spanish. When we come to queer and third gender identities, Michael Horswell's work really stands alone. According to his book, after the Spanish conquest in the region, the discourse, as I've said, of gender and sexuality shifted dramatically to obfuscate or hide any quote unquote sins, especially the sins of cross-dressing and sodomy. The idea of third spaces in his analysis to those areas before the conquest are related to homosocial environments. Horswell calls this idea a quote transculturation, or the creation of third gender spaces. Horswell notes that the Chinche, was a jaguar god whose devotees, called the Kariwarmi, were men-women shamans, quote, mediated between the symmetrically dualistic spheres of Andean cosmology and daily life by performing rituals that at times required same-sex erotic desire practices. He says their transvested attire served as a visible sign of a third space and negotiated between the masculine and the feminine. In other words, accessing the idea of masculine and feminine balance. Their shamanistic presence invoked an androgynous creative force often represented in Andean mythology. Richard Trexler, who also notes a Spanish account of these devotees, in which he says, and in each important temple, there is a house of worship. They have a man or two or more, depending on the idol, who go dressed in women's attire from the time they are children and speak like them, and in a manner dress and everything else they imitate women. Horswell notes that this description of a Spaniard going into a house of ill repute may also have been a sacred temple of the Incan Empire, suggesting ritual sacred prostitution, which was an ancient practice in many world cultures and religions. Horswell notes how the Quechuan languages even code switched. They took pronouns when referring to the Chuchi or others in the temples and switched them from male to female, or had a gender fluid pronoun as well. The widespread homosocial spaces, legends of men who restrained giants or of women who swore off men completely throughout the northern regions of the empire, and various pieces of moche pottery from the 8th to 13th centuries depicting same-sex overt actions, which were ignored, according to Horswell, for centuries until the 1970s, for their homoerotic subtext, reveal a quietude in the interpretation of queer Andean ideologies. It seems like people weren't asking questions about queerness in the pre-conquest period until quite recently. Horswell goes on to note that he thinks there's a good way to talk about third gender subjectivity with regard to the Andean cultures. Third gender subjectivity, in his view, is best represented in the concept of tinkyu, or the merger of mutual binaries through ritual mediation. More simply, that is something like a gender binary being worked out in cultural forms, pottery, spaces, rituals, which support the concept of gender nonconformity and as well gender fluidity. In short, it creates a third gender space by taking the genders and mixing them. Terms like Chuki, Chinche, and Kwarimari are among the Incas, for example, refer directly to sacred roles outside of the gender binary role of gender. The rituals, for example, one risks falling out of the trap of all indigenous sexual expression necessarily occurring within ritual, sacred, or magical context, exoticizing native sexualities as well as encapsulating them in the distinct past is another way of colonizing them. In short, the Chuki Chinche was the Andean dual gender god, specifically the mountain deity of the jaguars, who is celebrated by contemporary Andean and Quechuan cultures today in the same regards. They were attended to by third gender shamans known as the Kwarimari, who cross-dressed and mediated dualism of Andean cosmology, performing same-sex erotic practices. So when we come to conclusions, we have more questions than answers. We've seen the ideas of Tinkyu, Patlache, and Xochihua, as well as gender balance and transvestism in the gender roles of deities, material culture, and historical record. What we have not discussed in detail is the period from 1500 to 1850, in which the Spanish conquest, Inquisition, colonial period, atrocities against people who were cross-dressed or committed acts of sodomy. While this history cannot be ignored, we have attempted to show through scholarship of what other people have done that have been named queer subjectivities and have existed before conquest. The terrible truth is that queerness was used, amongst other reasons, to destroy indigenous cultures, a fact which has been long neglected because we were afraid to ask the questions. While we cannot ignore the atrocities, and we can better talk about them, centuries of oppression and different kinds of subjectivities begin to emerge from the discourse. We can attempt to restore a queer indigenous knowledge absent from the historical record. Queer lives depend upon knowing their past and seeing their hands in history and using the lives of those who came before as guideposts to our own legacy. While we have to ask more questions to talk about gender and sexuality, for instance, what does the story of gender and sexuality look like before and after conquest? How did gender and sexual cultures begin to change in response to it? How do queer lives begin to be affected by that change today? The quotes we leave you with come from Pick and Chacuna, whose articles are cited here, that the historical and linguistic archives are crucial, even if they defy translation. They refer to social fabrics and have been largely disrupted and repressed or destroyed for centuries. During Brazil's national meeting of indigenous students in 2017, a group discussed self-determination through issues ranging from land demarcation to LGBTQ issues. Indigenous people often utilize the global sexual rights framework of self-representation and rights claims. In 2013, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Organization of American States heard the testimonies of LGBTQ people at a panel called The Situation of Human Rights of LGBTQ People and Intersex People in the Americas, which they determined was grave, and which they determined the future of LGBTQ people in the Americas depends upon accessing the past. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you for your time. And now we move on to Q&A.
Okay, thanks. Oh no, I didn't go away. I thought I went away. All right. Thank you. So, yeah, if you have questions, please raise your hands or pop it in the chat. And I'm really sorry, my computer completely froze in Zoom. It's never happened before, and I had to shut down and come back in. So, somebody want to start us off? I can start us off. I can always ask a question. I was really interested in kind of your discussion of balance being really important in what seemed to me essentially patriarchal cultures, right? Yes, would you accept that statement?
I mean, I would say that in the literature, they talk about how there were hegemonic masculinities in Latin America before the Spanish conquest, and that the creation of states is definitely related to the kinds of societies that come afterwards. So the idea of balance being associated with spiritualism in the pre-Columbian societies and the pre-conquest societies is definitely associated with balance, but I don't think that that's completely unique to those cultures at that time. I think that that's true of many cultures in different times. The idea of the dialectic of masculine and feminine energies.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think there was something in the chat about putting the sources out.
Yes, I will link the presentation in just a moment.
Are there questions? Oh, come on. That it's Monday night. Oh, yeah. Despite the emphasis on language in the beginning, you use the words cross-dressing, transvestism, homosexual, and male and female. Sometimes these were direct quotes, but you also use them in these discussions. Why use archaic, problematic terms?
I'm not sure I understand the nature of the question. Oh, I see. Using the idea of cross-dressing and transvestism and homosexual and male and female as problematic terms?
I think he's asking to clarify.
So unfortunately, in some cases, the language gets tricky and we pull directly from the sources. So apologies if I used archaic terms. I'm pulling from sources which in some cases are 20 to 25 years old. And the idea of cross-dressing and the idea of male, female, and transvestism and homosexual is kind of related to the idea in those senses of people um, who were embodying themselves in different ways. And again, the clarification should be that we're using contemporary and even contemporary archaic terms to describe cultures which are hundreds of years old. And those are the terms in which the original historians who interpreted those pieces were using them as well. So I made the mistake of continuing to use those terms without switching them to contemporary ones.
Terms are really tricky. They're kind of layers when you're looking at the past and dealing with historiography. We're thinking about our terms today and then the terms of the historians that we're using to help us interpret the past, and then the terms that the people of the past that we're looking at. So we're kind of thinking about all of this in a variety of layers, and sometimes it's very difficult to make choices about which of those terms we're using at what times. And sometimes you make the choice to use a particular term that's not necessarily the term that's current now. But you need to explain it. It's true.
I can speak to this a little bit as well in my own research. Even looking 20, 30, 40 years back, the terms we use now, even within the queer community of the past, can be a little bit fluid and tricky because occasionally I think words like transvestite and crossdresser were used by the community 20, 30, 40 years back, while today they are not used quite as much. And there's the debate of, do I use the more current, correct term, or the term that the community itself used at the time to describe themselves? Like, which is the more accurate way of speaking of the community?
Yeah, that's an excellent question to raise. Yeah, hi. I can unmute you.
Hello, thank you so much for the information. As a trans feminine person, last night I forced myself to watch the Dave Chappelle special to kind of get an understanding of the current discourse. And so tonight's presentation was a very good reverse from that. But I do have a question. I'm doing a current research project for my semester on the linguistics of kind of like the linguistics of gender in the Spanish language. And you mentioned kind of briefly when you were covering the Quechua, a usage of pronouns and gender neutral pronouns. And I was wondering if you might be able to elaborate a little bit on that and like which pronouns they were, how they functioned grammatically. And I know that it's not in Spanish, but do you have any information on the linguistics of that?
Fortunately, I'm not a linguistic person. I'm kind of just an amateur historian. But I can say this: Michael Horswell's book is really good on that subject. It's called Decolonizing the Sodomite. It's chapter 4, I believe, in which he uses the analysis of Quechuan languages. And then when you look at the syllabaries from the Spanish of the 15th century that he talks about in chapter 1, you see the reification of gender binary. That's such a stupid word I used. You see gender binary enforced through language. So through the Spanish language, through él or ella, and not through any sort of third gender term, which he says in the discourse of that century drives down or basically erases people's ability to be gender performative in different ways between the indigenous culture and the hegemonic masculinity of, or the hegemonic Spanish Empire. What that means is that linguistically, there's just no way to identify oneself differently in the Spanish language. So he talks about how they create patois of the mother tongue. So you use the adjectives and the nouns of the indigenous language, but the grammatical structure of the conquest language, say Spanish in this case, or French. You see a similar case in Yoruba languages carrying over into the patois of, say, French or Spanish Creole in Haiti and in the New World, particularly when they start to switch gender pronouns as well. We have another talk planned for January where we talk about the history of gender identities and sexualities in the African diaspora. And that's one aspect you see of conquest languages, that gender binary is enforced through pronouns and through language in and of itself, not just through the laws, right? So one can't call oneself what one feels if one is third gendered in anything but the hegemonic language. So that alters the culture. So it erases queer people in that regard. But I think Horswell does a really good job of talking about that in chapter 1 and links to some queer historians who talk about the idea of gender performative, gender and language.
Thanks.
Thanks. Any other questions? Or comments from Emily or Jen?
Yes. I'm from old school, okay? I need to explain this to you. Understand, in the old days when people transitioned, they went from a CD group to a TS group. What happened is people saw themselves where they were. I'm not a CD, I'm a TS. I belong to the other group. That's how people did things. Also, it's just that there's no big deal. People who did things years ago remember things that are horrendous that you guys don't know. And the thing is, you need to respect the elders because they went through a lot of pain to get to where they were. And I just need to let you guys know that I respect everything the new generation is doing, but do not knock the old generation because they brought you here. They did the things they had to do when they could not do. And they did it in totally different ways. It was called androgyny, and there's nothing wrong with androgyny because what it does is it melts your mind together and brings both sides together. And that's a beautiful thing, especially when you transition. I'm sorry, but I had to say that. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Jen. We have another question in the chat. In your research, have you found many perspectives that incorporate Indigenous voices, or is it primarily white scholars? It's a great question.
This is a really good question on authenticity. If you see the work of Zeb Tortorici, Zeb was I think Harvard scholar who went back and looked at the histories of the Inquisition, but he cultivated a group of trans and indigenous people from Mexico and Central America who did their original scholarship in Spanish. And that edition that he has, which I have around here somewhere, his work really touches on the aspects of that. So the scholars within Tortorici's sphere are indigenous and have voices from a Spanish-speaking perspective. But the earlier scholarship going back, say, 25 or 30 years, particularly before Horswell, that is more cisgender white male, as far as I can tell.
All right.
And I would say that Tortorici's work is after 2010.
Yeah, most of this work is really recent in historical terms. Yeah. All right, well, let's thank our researchers and David for presenting. And I hope you have good takeaways here. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming.